To say that Ilara's life was governed by routine was to say that the moon was governed by the tides. It was a fact so fundamental it was rarely considered. Her days were charted by the quiet chime of the library clock, the precise weight of a returned book in her hands, the scent of aging paper and lemon polish that clung to her clothes like a second skin. Her world was a meticulously curated collection of small, predictable comforts. The hiss of the espresso machine at the corner cafe just after dawn. The specific creak of the third step on the stairs to her small apartment. The way the evening light, filtered through the city's haze, turned the brick of the opposite building a soft, bruised purple. It was a life built of quiet observation, a fortress against the unpredictable chaos of the world outside her carefully drawn lines. And every evening, on her walk home, she passed the alley. It was a dark slash between a laundromat that always smelled of scorched cotton and a shuttered butcher shop, a place where the city's refuse collected in damp piles and the shadows grew long and sharp even before sunset. For 3 weeks, he had been there, a fixture in the deepest recess of the alley, propped against the grimy brickwork. He was a man made of stillness and shadow. The first time she saw him, she had flinched, her hand tightening on the strap of her satchel, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. He was just a shape, a huddled form in layers of dark, ragged clothing. But he did not move, did not call out, did not even seem to register her passing. He simply existed, a point of absolute silence in the city's unending noise. Her fear had slowly, over days, given way to a cautious curiosity, which in turn had softened into a dull, persistent ache of something she could only identify as compassion. He was so utterly alone, more alone than even she felt in her quiet apartment with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. His solitude was a vast, ancient thing, while hers was merely a habit. So, one Tuesday, when the autumn air had turned sharp and a miserable, needle-thin rain began to fall, she did something that broke the sacred geometry of her routine. She stopped at a small diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a perpetually steaming coffee pot, and bought a thermos of chicken soup and a thick wedge of buttered bread wrapped in wax paper. Her heart hammered a nervous rhythm against her sternum as she approached the alley. The rain slicked the pavement, making the city lights bleed into long, distorted ribbons. He was there, exactly as he always was, his face obscured by the deep shadow of a hood. He looked less like a man and more like a stone that the city had grown around. She stopped at the mouth of the alley, the warmth of the thermos a small, solid comfort in her hands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice small against the hiss of the rain. He did not move. For a moment, she thought he was asleep, or worse. She took a hesitant step closer, the scent of wet asphalt and decay filling her senses. I brought you something." Her voice trembled slightly. This was foolish. He could be dangerous. He could be anything. "It's soup. It's warm." Slowly, as if moving through water, his head lifted. She still couldn't see his face, not really, but she felt the weight of his attention settle on her. It was a physical pressure, a profound and unnerving focus that made the air feel thick in her lungs. He did not look at the thermos. He looked at her. A long, silent moment stretched between them, filled only by the patter of the rain. She felt utterly exposed, as if he could see past her rain-dampened coat and nervous smile, right into the quiet, lonely architecture of her soul. Then, a hand emerged from the ragged sleeve of his coat. It was a long-fingered hand, grime-caked and pale, but the movement was not the desperate snatch she had braced herself for. It was slow, deliberate, almost graceful. He extended it, palm up, a silent invitation. Her breath hitched. She stepped forward, her shoes crunching softly on unseen debris, and placed the thermos and the wrapped bread into his hand. His fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a shock through her, a startling, icy cold that seemed to sink deep into her bones. It was a cold that felt ancient, a cold from a place where the sun had never shone. He drew his hand back, cradling the offerings. His head dipped in a motion that might have been a nod of thanks, and then he was still again, a statue returned to its plinth. Ilara stood there for another moment, rain dripping from her hair onto her face, the strange, profound cold of his touch still tingling in her fingertips. She had expected to feel relief, or perhaps the quiet satisfaction of a good deed done. Instead, she felt seen. in a way that was both terrifying and deeply, inexplicably compelling. She turned and walked away, the rhythm of her footsteps quickening, but she could feel his silent gaze on her back all the way to the corner. That night, sleep did not come easily. The predictable comfort of her routine had been fractured, and in its place was a question, shaped like a man made of shadows and an impossible, ancient cold. The next day, the thermos was sitting just inside the alley's entrance, washed clean. That single, simple act became the new, unwritten clause in her daily contract. The purchase of a hot meal, a thermos of coffee, a thick sandwich, it was now the final beat of her workday, the bridge between the quiet order of the library and the solitary peace of her apartment. Each evening, she would approach the alley, her heart a little less frantic each time, and he would be there. He never spoke. He would simply lift his head as she drew near, the weight of his gaze a silent acknowledgement, and extend that pale, long-fingered hand. The brief, shocking touch of his skin against hers became a familiar ritual, a jolt of impossible cold that she began to anticipate, almost to crave. It was a secret language spoken in the space of a heartbeat, an exchange that felt more meaningful than most of the polite, empty conversations that filled her days. She learned him in fragments, in the details her observant nature couldn't help but catalogue. The way he held himself, even huddled in the cold, possessed a strange, unbent dignity. There was no slump of despair in his shoulders, no shuffling uncertainty. He was a creature of profound stillness, as if he were waiting. Not for her, she knew, but for something else, something vast and inevitable. His clothes, though tattered and stained, seemed to have once been of fine quality. The dark wool of his coat held a faint, almost imperceptible pattern in its weave, and the leather of his boots, though cracked and worn, was shaped with an artisan's care. These were not the cast-offs of a common vagrant. They were the ruins of something that had once been magnificent. Sometimes, she would bring him a book. It was a librarian's instinct, a belief that a story could be a shelter as real as any roof. The first time, it was a worn paperback of Stoic philosophy, something she thought might offer a different kind of warmth. She placed it beside the food, and when she retrieved the thermos the next day, the book was gone. She never saw him reading, but she imagined him turning the pages in the dark, the words a small glow against the overwhelming night. She brought him poetry, histories, tales of forgotten lands. It was another one-sided conversation, her offering of worlds contained in paper and ink. One evening, nearly a month into their silent ritual, a storm rolled in, a violent, lashing thing that tore at the city with wind and a percussive, driving rain. The streets were nearly empty, the city hunkered down against the assault. Ilara's umbrella was useless, turned inside out by a sudden gust, and she was soaked through by the time she reached the alley, her hair plastered to her face, rainwater trickling down her neck. She almost turned back, convinced he would have found better shelter, but a strange compulsion pulled her forward. He was there, pressed deeper into the recess of a bricked-up doorway, but he was no less exposed. The rain ran in rivulets from the edge of his hood, dripping onto his knees. He looked, for the first time, not like a stoic statue, but like something besieged. She held out the steaming container of stew, her own hands trembling from the cold. As he reached for it, his hand seemed paler than usual, the skin stretched taut over his knuckles. His fingers brushed hers, and the cold was sharper this time, a deep, biting frost that seemed to leach the warmth from her very blood. He didn't immediately retreat. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second, a light, questioning pressure against her own. In that moment, she saw his face more clearly than she ever had before. The hood of his coat had fallen back slightly, and in the chaotic, flickering light from a street lamp across the way, she saw high cheekbones, a strong, straight nose, and a mouth that was a firm, unsmiling line. His skin was unnaturally pale, like marble, and his eyes were dark, cavernous voids that seemed to swallow the light. But in their depths, she saw not emptiness, but a profound, ancient weariness. An exhaustion so complete it felt geological in scale. A gust of wind drove the rain sideways, and she flinched, shivering. Without thinking, she began to shrug off her own coat, a thick wool thing that was her best defense against the winter. It was a foolish, impulsive gesture. "Don't," a voice said. The word was low, a rasping sound, as if his vocal cords had forgotten their purpose. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her. The sound vibrated through the damp air, more felt than heard, and it stopped her cold. She stared at him, her coat half off her shoulders. "You'll freeze," she managed to say, her own voice tight. His gaze held hers, and the weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen. "My cold is not of the weather," he said. The words were sculpted with a strange, formal cadence, each syllable precise. "Keep your warmth. You have little enough of it to spare." He drew back into the shadows, the food held in his hands. The moment was broken. She was left standing in the rain, the echo of his voice resonating in her ears, a deep, resonant baritone that held the gravel of ages. It was a voice that did not belong in a wet alleyway. It was a voice that belonged to throne rooms and forgotten histories. She pulled her coat back on, her fingers clumsy, her mind reeling. He had spoken. He had seen her shivering and told her to keep her coat. It was a small thing, a simple courtesy, but coming from this man of absolute silence, it felt like a cataclysm. It changed everything. The boundary between them, the one-way mirror of her charity, had shattered. Now, they were two people, standing in the rain. And one of them was a complete, terrifying, and utterly captivating mystery. His voice became a rare and precious currency, spent only when absolutely necessary, which made each word he offered feel like a treasure unearthed. 2 nights after the storm, as she handed him a small foil-wrapped parcel of roasted chicken, he did not immediately retreat. The air was cold and clean, the sky a canopy of bruised velvet pricked with a few hardy stars. "You have been kind," he said, his voice that same low, gravelly resonance that seemed to startle the very air. There is no reason for it. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a puzzle he was examining from all sides. Ilara clutched the handle of her empty satchel, the worn leather a familiar anchor in this sea of strangeness. "Everyone deserves a little kindness," she said, the words sounding thin and idealistic even to her own ears. He considered this for a long moment, his head tilted slightly. The darkness in his hood was absolute, but she could feel the intensity of his focus. "Deserve," he repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "That is a human concept. A scale of worth. I have not found it to be reliable." "Well, I'm human," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "It's the only scale I have." A silence fell, but it was different from the ones that had come before. It was not empty, it was filled with the weight of his contemplation. "What are you called?" he asked, the question so direct it made her breath catch. Ilara. The name felt strange, leaving her lips and floating into the cold air of the alley. It felt too plain, too small for the gravity of the moment. "Ilara," he repeated, and the sound of her own name, spoken in that ancient voice, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It sounded like a word from a forgotten language, a name with history and weight. He gave a slight, formal dip of his head. "I am Cosimir." Cosimir. The name was as out of place as his voice, as his stillness. It was a name of jagged peaks and old-world kings, not of rain-slicked alleys and charity. It settled between them, a piece of himself he had finally offered in return for her soup and her books. From that night on, their exchanges, while still brief, became colored with a new intimacy. He would ask her about her day, his questions precise and oddly insightful. He wanted to know what book she was cataloging, what the light was like in the library's reading room in the late afternoon, what song was stuck in her head. He was a collector of her small, mundane details, hoarding them like jewels. She, in turn, grew bolder, though her questions were always gentle, respectful of the deep privacy he wore like a shroud. She asked him once where he was from. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, he said, from a place where the nights are much longer. The answer was a poem, a riddle, and it only deepened the mystery. One evening, she found him not in his usual spot, but standing at the mouth of the alley, gazing out at the river of traffic on the main street. The posture was so different, so alien. He was tall, she realized with a jolt. Stripped of his huddled crouch, he had a lean, powerful frame that the ragged coat could not entirely disguise. He stood with his back to her, perfectly straight, his hands clasped behind him. It was the stance of a monarch surveying his domain, or a general watching a battlefield. The sheer incongruity of it, this regal posture amidst the squalor, was breathtaking. He turned as she approached, his movement fluid and silent. "The world has become so loud," he observed, his gaze sweeping over the flashing lights and the blare of horns. "All this frantic motion. And yet, no one seems to be going anywhere of consequence." "It's just Friday night," Ilara said, offering a small, nervous smile. "Everyone's rushing to get home. Or rushing to get out." "Rushing," he mused. I had forgotten the feeling. He looked at her then, and for the first time, a flicker of something that wasn't weariness or detached observation entered his eyes. It was a raw, aching loneliness, a desolation so profound it made her own quiet solitude seem like a crowded room. It was the look of a man who had been alone for centuries, not weeks. "You don't have to stay here," she heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "In the cold. There are shelters, places." His expression shuttered instantly, the brief vulnerability vanishing as if it had never been. "Those places are not for me," he said, his voice flat and final. "I have my reasons for being here." The finality in his tone was a wall she could not scale. She simply nodded, handing him the bag with a warm pastry and a bottle of water. Their fingers did not touch this time. A new distance had opened between them, a reminder that for all their brief conversations, she knew nothing about him. He was Casimir, a man with a king's name and a poet's answers, who stood like a general and spoke of endless nights. And he was a complete stranger, a man who lived in an alley and chose the cold over a roof. The thought was a disquieting one, a small seed of fear planting itself in the fertile ground of her compassion. She said her usual quiet goodnight and walked away, a growing sense of unease settling over her. The city felt different tonight, its shadows deeper, its noises more threatening. She found herself looking over her shoulder as she walked, a primitive instinct she couldn't quell, a feeling that she and her strange, silent friend were not the only ones watching the night. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday, under a sky the color of a fading bruise. The air was heavy with the promise of more rain, and a chill wind snaked through the streets, carrying with it the scent of exhaust and damp leaves. Ilara was later than usual. A special collection had arrived at the library, a set of medieval manuscripts on celestial cartography, and she had lost herself in the delicate ink drawings of constellations that no longer existed, her fingers tracing the ghosts of forgotten stars. By the time she left, the streetlights had been on for hours, casting pools of lonely, orange light on the wet pavement. A sense of unease pricked at her as she turned onto her street. It was quieter than usual, the usual flow of evening traffic thinned to a trickle. She clutched the warm paper bag in her hand, a simple meal of bread and cheese and an apple, and quickened her pace. The mouth of Casimir's alley loomed, a rectangle of deeper darkness. She expected to see him there, a familiar silhouette against the brick, but the space was empty. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. He was always there. It was the one certainty in this strange new chapter of her life. She hesitated, peering into the gloom. "Casimir," she called, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer but the sigh of the wind. Against her better judgment, she took a step into the alley, then another. It was foolish, dangerous, but the thought of him being gone, or worse, hurt, was a far greater fear than the darkness. Her eyes slowly adjusted, and she saw him then, not in his usual spot, but further back, half hidden by a large, overflowing dumpster. He was not alone. Two men had him cornered. They were big, hulking shapes, their laughter a low, ugly sound that echoed off the damp brick. One of them held a length of metal pipe, tapping it idly against his palm. The other was rifling through the meager collection of Casimir's belongings, a threadbare blanket, one of the books she had given him. "Got nothing," the man with the book grumbled, tossing it into a puddle with a wet smack. "Just trash." "Everyone's got something," the one with the pipe said, taking a menacing step toward Casimir. "Let's check his pockets. Maybe he's got a gold tooth." Casimir was utterly still, his back pressed against the wall. He did not look at them. His head was bowed, his face hidden in shadow. He looked defeated, small, exactly what they saw him as, a helpless vagrant. But Ilara, who had spent weeks studying his stillness, saw something else. It was not the stillness of surrender. It was the coiled, waiting stillness of a panther, a gathering of potential energy so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the alley. Ilara's blood ran cold. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream for help, to do anything but stand there, frozen. But her feet were rooted to the spot. They hadn't seen her. Before she could process a single rational thought, a raw, protective instinct took over. "Leave him alone." The voice was hers, but it sounded high and thin, a stranger's shriek. Both men whipped around, their faces masks of surprise that quickly curdled into predatory grins. "Well, look what we have here," the man with the pipe said, his eyes raking over her. "A little bird, come to protect her nest." He started toward her, and the world seemed to slow down, to stretch like taffy. She saw the glint of the streetlight on the pipe, the missing tooth in his smile, the greasy stain on his jacket. Her heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. This was it. This was the stupid, reckless end to her quiet, ordered life. She took an involuntary step back, her heel catching on a loose paving stone. She stumbled, the paper bag falling from her hand, the apple rolling into the gutter. And in that moment of distraction, everything happened at once. It wasn't a sound that alerted her, but a change in the quality of the air, a sudden, violent displacement. From the corner of her eye, she saw a blur of motion, a streak of black so fast it was barely perceivable. Kosimir was no longer against the wall. He was between her and the man with the pipe. He hadn't run, he had simply moved. One moment there, the next here. The space between the 2 points had ceased to exist. The man with the pipe grunted, a choked, wet sound. He stared down at his own chest in disbelief. Casimir's hand was resting there, almost gently. But the man's eyes were wide with a terror that went beyond pain. Kosimir lifted his head, and for the first time, Ilara saw his face fully illuminated by the harsh, overhead glare of a security light. It was a face of terrible, ancient beauty, a sculpture of pale marble and sharp angles. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were no longer dark, weary voids. They were glowing, 2 embers of crimson light, burning with a cold, predatory fire that was utterly inhuman. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that was not of this world, a sound that spoke of endless hunger and the absolute authority of the apex predator. He gave a slight, almost casual twist of his wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The man with the pipe collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, silent and still. The other man, the one who had been by the dumpster, simply stared, his mouth hanging open, a thin whimper escaping his lips. He dropped the blanket and scrambled backward, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the wet brick. Kosimir turned his head, his movements unnervingly fluid, impossibly graceful. Those burning, crimson eyes fixed on the remaining man. He took a single, slow step forward. He didn't run. He didn't need to. The sheer, overwhelming menace pouring off him was a physical force, a wall of absolute dread. The man shrieked, a high, animal sound of pure terror, and fled, stumbling and falling over his own feet as he scrambled out of the alley and disappeared into the night. The alley was suddenly, profoundly silent. The only sounds were the distant wail of a siren and the frantic, ragged sound of Ilara's own breathing. Kosimir stood over the crumpled form on the ground, his back to her. The terrible, glowing light in his eyes slowly faded, leaving them dark once more. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep, controlled breath. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, shattering vulnerability. The predator was gone, and in his place was the man she knew, the quiet, weary man from the shadows. But the image of what she had just seen was burned into her mind, the impossible speed, the inhuman strength, the glowing red eyes. He looked at her pale face and wide, terrified eyes, and she saw an emotion in his gaze that was far worse than the fury he had shown her attackers. It was fear. He was afraid of her. The revelation was a physical shock, a jolt that cleared her head better than a slap. He had just saved her life, had revealed some monstrous, hidden part of himself to do so, and his first reaction was not triumph or rage, but a deep, profound fear of her rejection. The alley was cold, filled with the scent of rain and violence, and at its center stood the greatest mystery of her life, waiting for her judgment. Her heart, which had been hammering with terror, now began to ache with a different, more complex emotion. The world she knew, with its neat lines and predictable routines, had just been ripped apart, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that it would never be the same. "Ilara," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. It was a plea. She stared at him, the protector, the monster, the man who knew her name. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken question hanging between them. She saw the body on the ground, a stark and brutal fact. She saw the impossible truth in his weary eyes. Her fear was a living thing, a cold, writhing knot in her stomach. It screamed at her to run, to leave this alley and its terrible secrets behind, to retreat to the safety of her quiet, ordered world. But beneath the fear was something else, something stronger. It was the memory of his voice asking about her day, the image of the clean thermos left for her, the profound loneliness she had seen in his gaze. He took a small, hesitant step back, as if to give her space to flee. The movement was one of self-abnegation, of someone expecting to be abandoned. It was the gesture of a king who had forgotten he wore a crown. And it broke her heart. What are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling but steady. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, born of a need to understand, not to condemn. Casimir's shoulders, which had been tense with anticipation, slumped in a wave of what looked like relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of deep, ancient pain crossing his features. "I am other," he said, the words carefully chosen. "Older than the city. Older than the stones it is built on. I am what your stories call a vampire." Vampire. The word landed in the quiet alley with the weight of a tombstone. It was a word from her books, from fiction and myth, a creature of velvet capes and Gothic castles. It had no place here, in this grimy, modern space. And yet, it explained everything. The impossible speed. The inhuman strength. The profound, biting cold of his skin. The eyes that burned like embers. It was an absurd, impossible truth, and she believed him instantly, utterly. The evidence was lying in a heap not 10 feet away. "The man," she whispered, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the body. "Is he?" "No," Casimir said quickly, his voice firm. "He is not dead. Unconscious. His bones will mend. He will wake in a hospital with a story no one will believe. I am not a killer of mortals for sport." He paused, his gaze intense. "But I could have been. I could have lost control. The hunger is always there." He said the last words with a self-loathing that was chilling. He was talking about a part of himself as if it were a caged beast, one that was constantly testing the bars of its prison. He expected her to recoil, to see him now as only the monster. But Ilara was a librarian. Her life was spent in the careful study of context, in understanding that a single page never tells the whole story. She had seen the beast, yes, but she had also seen the man who fought it. She had seen the creature of impossible power, but she had also seen the lonely soul who treasured her small kindnesses. The two were not separate. They were both Casimir. She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. Then she took a step toward him. He flinched, a barely perceptible motion, as if expecting a blow. She stopped, her heart aching for him. Instead of moving closer, she bent down and picked up the book he had been reading, the one the other man had thrown into the puddle. It was a collection of poetry she'd brought him last week. The cover was soaked, the pages warped. Carefully, she wiped the grime from it with the sleeve of her coat. She held it out to him. "This can be saved," she said softly. "It just needs to be dried carefully, page by page." Casimir stared at the book in her hand, then his gaze lifted to her face. He looked utterly bewildered, as if she had just started speaking in a language he had never heard before. He had shown her his monster, and she was offering him back his poetry. "You are not afraid," he stated, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "Oh, I'm terrified," she admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her lips. "But not of you. Not in the way you think." She was afraid of the violence, of this new, dangerous world that had just opened up at her feet. But the man standing before her, the man who had protected her, who was now looking at her with such raw, desperate hope. She was not afraid of him. He slowly reached out and took the book from her, his cold fingers brushing against hers. This time, the chill did not make her flinch. It was just a part of him. He held the damp, ruined book as if it were a holy relic. "Why?" he whispered, the question encompassing everything. Why the soup? Why the books? Why this? Why was she not screaming and running for her life? Ilara looked at him, at the ancient, weary soul hiding behind the eyes of a predator. "Because," she said, the answer rising from the deepest, truest part of herself. "You looked lonely." The simple, honest words seemed to strike him with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back a step, a look of profound, shattered disbelief on his face. In all his long, long years, through empires rising and falling, through wars and betrayals and the endless, crushing weight of immortality, it was a truth he had never expected to hear spoken aloud. That someone had looked past the shadows, past the stillness, and had seen not a threat or a project, but a kindred spirit in solitude. A low, rumbling sound came from the street, growing louder. Headlights swept across the mouth of the alley. "We have to go," Kosimir said, his voice suddenly urgent. The spell of the moment was broken. "They will come. The authorities. They will have questions I cannot answer, and they will see things they should not see." He looked at her, and the choice was there in his eyes, stark and clear. She could leave. She could walk out of the alley, back into her life, and pretend none of this had ever happened. She could go back to the library, to her quiet apartment, to her predictable routines. Or she could step forward, into his world of shadows and secrets. Her life had been a fortress built of small, safe things. And he was the storm that had just smashed through its walls. But she found, to her own astonishment, that she was not mourning the ruins. She was looking at the vast, terrifying, star-filled sky that had just been revealed. She met his gaze, her own resolve hardening into something bright and clear. "Where are we going?" she asked. It wasn't a question of destination. It was a statement of allegiance. "I am with you." The words went unsaid, but he heard them all the same. A flicker of something that looked like hope, fragile and brilliant, ignited in the depths of his dark eyes. For the first time since she had met him, Kosimir looked a little less alone. The world dissolved into a blur of motion. Kosimir took her hand, his grip firm, possessive, and still so cold, and pulled her deeper into the alley. "This way," he commanded, his voice losing its weary rasp and taking on an edge of authority she had never heard before. He moved with a silent, flowing grace that defied the cluttered, narrow space. He led her to the back wall of the alley, a solid expanse of brick that seemed to offer no escape. For a panicked moment, Ilara thought they were trapped. But Kosimir placed his free hand on the wall, his fingers tracing a pattern in the grime that was invisible to her eye. There was a low grinding sound, like stone on stone, and a section of the wall, a piece disguised as a bricked-up doorway, swung inward, revealing a passage of absolute, impenetrable blackness. It was a darkness that seemed to drink the ambient light of the city, a darkness that smelled of damp earth, cold stone, and the passage of centuries. "Stay close," he murmured, and led her through the opening. The stone door swung shut behind them with a heavy, final thud, plunging them into a silence so complete it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. The sounds of the city, the sirens, the traffic, the entire frantic pulse of the modern world were gone, sliced away as if they had never existed. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast quiet. She couldn't see anything, not even the man whose hand was still wrapped firmly around hers. She was suspended in a void, her only anchor his impossibly cold touch. "I can't see," she whispered, her voice sounding loud and intrusive in the stillness. "You don't need to," his voice came from the darkness beside her. "I can." There was a soft scraping sound, and then a tiny flame sputtered to life, casting long, dancing shadows. He had produced a small, old-fashioned lighter, and in its flickering glow, he lit a torch that was resting in a sconce on the wall. The sudden bloom of warm, orange light revealed they were in a narrow, stone-lined tunnel. The air was frigid, and the walls wept with moisture, but it was dry underfoot. "The city is a new thing," Kosimir explained, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Built on the bones of what came before. There are pathways, forgotten places, that predate its every street and foundation. He began to walk, holding the torch aloft, and she had no choice but to follow. As they moved deeper into the earth, the tunnel opened into a series of larger catacombs, a labyrinth of brick and stone. He navigated them with an unerring confidence, taking turns that seemed identical to Alara, his steps sure and silent on the stone floor. He was at home here, in the deep, dark heart of the world. The man who had seemed so out of place in the modern city was in his element. "You said you had your reasons for being there," she said, the memory of his words from that other lifetime, the one before she knew his secret, surfacing. "In the alley." He was silent for a long moment, his profile stark and noble in the torchlight. "I was resting," he said finally. "A long dormancy. The world had become too much. Too fast. Too bright. I needed to let it wash over me, to learn its new rhythms from a place of stillness. But my rest was disturbed. There are those who have been hunting me for a very long time." Before she could ask who they were, a new sound reached them. It was faint at first, a distant, rhythmic chanting, but it grew steadily louder as they walked. It was a human voice, deep and sonorous, speaking in a language Alara did not recognize. It was ancient, guttural, and melodic all at once. Casimir's pace quickened, a new tension in his shoulders. He led her around a final corner, and the narrow passage opened into a vast, circular chamber. The room was breathtaking. Its domed ceiling was lost in shadow high above, and the walls were lined with towering shelves, crammed not with books, but with scrolls, clay tablets, and leather-bound codices that looked impossibly ancient. In the center of the chamber, a single figure knelt before a low stone altar, a brazier of coals casting a warm, smoky light on his face. He was an old man, his head shaved, his face a roadmap of deep-carved lines. He was dressed in simple, dark robes, and it was his voice that filled the chamber with its resonant chant. He stopped mid-word as they entered, his head snapping up. His eyes, dark and piercing, widened first in shock, and then in a wave of overwhelming, reverent joy. He scrambled to his feet with a speed that belied his age. "My lord," he breathed, his voice cracking with emotion. He dropped to one knee, his head bowed low. "You have returned, Lord." The word hung in the air, freighted with meaning. Alara looked from the kneeling old man to Casimir, her mind struggling to connect the ragged, silent man from the alley with the title. Casimir's expression was unreadable, a mask of stoic gravity. "Rise, Alaric," he said, his tone one of gentle command. "There is no need for that." The old man, Alaric, rose, though his eyes never left Casimir's face. They were filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. "I never lost faith, my king," he said, his voice thick. "For 50 years, I have kept the archives, and I have waited. I knew you would not abandon us forever. King. My king." The word was a thunderclap in the quiet chamber. It recontextualized everything. The regal bearing, the formal speech, the unbent dignity. It hadn't been an affectation. It was the ingrained truth of his being. He wasn't just a vampire. He was a vampire king. A king who had been living in an alley, accepting her offerings of soup and bread. The sheer, staggering absurdity of it almost made her want to laugh. Alaric's gaze finally fell upon Alara, who was standing awkwardly just behind Casimir, still clutching her satchel. His eyes, which had been so full of warmth for his king, turned sharp and suspicious. "You bring a mortal with you, my lord? Into the sanctum?" "She is under my protection, Alaric," Casimir said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned slightly, positioning himself so that he was partially shielding her, a subtle, protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by either Alara or the old man. "Her name is Alara. She is the reason I am no longer resting." Alaric's gaze softened, his suspicion replaced by a dawning curiosity, and something akin to gratitude. He gave Alara a deep, formal bow. "Then we are in your debt, Lady Alara. To have woken the sleeper is a feat no other has managed." The formality was overwhelming. "Lady Alara." She felt a blush creep up her neck. She was a librarian from the 23rd precinct, not a lady of some ancient, subterranean court. She opened her mouth to say something, to correct him, but Casimir spoke first. "We were followed. My enemies grow bold. They walk in the open now, hunting on my very doorstep. His voice was cold, the voice of a ruler assessing a threat. I need to know what has happened in my absence. 50 years is a long time. Tell me of the conclave. Tell me of Valerus. A shadow passed over Alaric's face at the name. Valerus, he said, his voice low and laced with contempt. He has named himself Regent Protector. He tells the courts you are lost to the madness, a relic who could not bear the passage of time. He preaches a new doctrine of integration, of seizing power in the mortal world not from the shadows, but from within their own halls of power. He corrupts the old ways, my king. He amasses followers who are hungry for what he promises. Cosimir listened, his face impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He was ever ambitious, he murmured. And foolish. He thinks to rule the storm by becoming the lightning. He will only be consumed by the fire. He turned to Alara, his eyes dark with a new gravity. This is the world I have brought you into, he said softly, for her ears alone. A kingdom in shadow, a throne usurped, and a war brewing that will be fought in places you never knew existed. You saved me from an alley. But I fear I have led you into a cage. His honesty was a cold comfort. He wasn't trying to romanticize the danger or his position. He was showing her the truth, in all its perilous complexity. And in doing so, he was once again giving her a choice. The archive, the sanctum, as Alaric called it, became their world. It was a place outside of time, lit by the eternal, flickering glow of torches and braziers, the air thick with the dry, sweet scent of papyrus and decaying leather. For Alara, a librarian, it should have been a paradise. It was the ultimate collection, a library of civilizations, holding the unwritten histories of the world in its silent, dusty embrace. And yet, it felt like a gilded prison. The silence was absolute, the shadows profound. There was no sunrise, no sunset, no rain against a windowpane to mark the passage of days. Time became a fluid, meaningless concept. Cosimir was transformed. In the sanctum, surrounded by the legacy of his people, the weary vagrant was gone entirely, replaced by the king. He moved with a purpose and authority that was both captivating and intimidating. He and Alaric would spend hours poring over ancient maps and scrolls, their heads bent together in the torchlight, speaking in that low, guttural language of their ancestors. Ilara would watch them from a distance, feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of their world. She was the anomaly, the fragile, mortal creature with a heartbeat that must sound like a thunderclap in the pervasive silence. She tried to make herself useful. Her knowledge of preservation and cataloging was, to Alaric's initial surprise and eventual delight, more advanced than the arcane methods he had been using for centuries. She showed him how to create humidity-controlled environments for the most fragile scrolls using simple principles of physics, how to mend torn vellum with painstaking care. She began to create a new catalogue, translating Alaric's cryptic organizational system into something logical and cross-referenced. The work was a comfort, a piece of her old, ordered life she could impose upon this ancient, chaotic place. It gave her a purpose beyond the mortal under the king's protection. But it was in the quiet moments, in the hours when Alaric was asleep in his small adjoining cell, that she and Cosimir found their way back to each other. He would seek her out where she worked, a silent shadow detaching himself from the deeper darkness of the archive. He would watch her for a time, his gaze intense, as she carefully transcribed the title of a scroll onto a new tag. "You bring order to the chaos," he said one night, or what passed for night in that timeless place. He was standing beside a towering shelf, his long fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound book. "It's what I do," she replied without looking up, her focus on her careful lettering. "It's all I know how to do." "No," he said, his voice soft. "You know how to be kind. It is a rarer and more valuable skill." He came closer, his presence a familiar disruption in her personal space. He looked down at the text she was working on. It was an ancient Sumerian tablet, a record of grain distribution. "You spend your life preserving the mundane details of others. What of your own?" The question caught her off guard. She looked up at him. His face was serious, his eyes searching hers. "My life was very quiet," she said. "Not much to preserve. Just books, and coffee, and the walk home." And soup for a stranger in an alley, he added, his voice low. It was not a mundane detail for me, Elara. It was the first warmth I had felt in a century. The intimacy of the confession made her breath catch. This was the man she knew, the one beneath the crown. The lonely, weary soul. You never told me why, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Why you were there. Alaric said you were sleeping, but it seemed more than that. He turned away from her, walking over to the central brazier, its coals glowing a dull, angry red. He stared into them as if seeing visions in the heat. I abdicated, he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. I grew tired. Of the politics. Of the bloodshed. Of the endless, grinding weight of the years. My kind, we can live for millennia, but we do not always evolve. We are trapped by our own natures, our own ancient feuds. Valerus and his faction, they saw my weariness as weakness. They spoke of a new age, of power and dominion. I saw only the same old thirst for blood, dressed in new clothes. So I walked away from it all. I sought oblivion. A quiet fading. I laid myself down in the heart of the great, roaring machine of your city, hoping to be ground down into dust, to be forgotten. He turned back to her, and the agony in his eyes was raw. And then you came. With your kindness that asked for nothing in return. You anchored me to the world again. You reminded me that there were things beyond power and history. There was a simple, quiet goodness. You woke me up, Elara. And in doing so, you made me a target for those who wish I had slept forever. His guilt was a palpable thing. He saw her presence here, in this beautiful, suffocating prison, as his failure. He had dragged her from her safe, quiet life into his own personal war. That was my choice, she said, her voice firm. She stood up and walked to him, stopping just a few feet away. When I asked where we were going, that was my choice. You didn't drag me anywhere. You did not know what you were choosing, he countered, his voice tight with frustration. And you think that matters, she shot back, a spark of anger flashing within her. You think I'm a child who needs to have every danger explained before she can make a decision? I saw what you were. I saw what you did. And I chose to trust the man who was afraid of what I would think of him over the monster who could break a man's bones without a thought. That is who I chose to follow. His frustration seemed to dissolve, replaced by a stunned silence. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time not as a fragile human to be protected, but as an equal. Someone with her own will, her own courage. The danger is not abstract anymore, he said, his voice softer now. Valerus will not stop. He cannot afford to let me live. And as long as you are with me, you are the perfect leverage. You are my one, single vulnerability. The word hung in the air between them. Vulnerability. To his kind, a creature of power and predation, it must be the most terrifying word of all. He was admitting that she, a mortal librarian with a quiet life and a stubborn streak of compassion, had more power over him than any ancient rival or political enemy. She held a part of him that he could not protect with strength or speed. Before she could process the weight of his admission, Alaric appeared at the edge of the chamber, his face pale and grim in the torchlight. My king, he said, his voice urgent. The scrying bowl. I have seen them. A coven of hunters, loyal to Valerus. They are sweeping the old tunnels. They know you are no longer on the surface. They are closing in. Casimir's entire demeanor shifted. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced instantly by the strategist, the king. His eyes became hard, his posture rigid. How long? Hours. A day at most, Alaric said. They are methodical. They have things. Wards and instruments I do not recognize. Valerus has been busy in your absence, consorting with those who practice darker arts. The comfortable silence of the sanctum was gone, replaced by a ticking clock. The walls, which had felt like a shelter, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. Elara looked at Casimir, at the grim resolve on his face, and she felt not fear, but a strange, fierce clarity. Her quiet life was gone. Her fortress had fallen. And she would not stand by and watch the man who had shown her the sky be dragged back into the darkness. She had a role to play, and it was not as a damsel to be protected. She was a librarian. And this was the greatest library in the world. Valerus is hunting you, Ilara said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Both Cosimir and Alaric turned to look at her. She was standing by one of the tables, her hands flat on its stone surface, her knuckles white. He thinks you're a relic, a king from a forgotten age. He preaches a new way. So, he'll be using new methods. Alaric scoffed, a flicker of pride in his tired eyes. The sanctum is protected by blood wards laid down at the dawn of time. No magic, new or old, can find this place. He's not using magic to find the sanctum, Ilara insisted, her mind working furiously, connecting disparate pieces of information with the practiced logic of a researcher. He's using it to find him. She looked at Cosimir. These hunters, they're not searching the tunnels randomly. They're tracking you. You're the beacon. Cosimir nodded slowly, a grim understanding dawning on his face. A sympathetic link. A difficult art. It would require something of mine. Something personal. His eyes darkened as the implication settled. Betrayal. Someone from my own court must have aided him. It doesn't matter how they're doing it, Ilara pressed on, her voice gaining confidence. What matters is that this place, this library, isn't just a hiding place. It's an arsenal. You're fighting a war of ideas as much as a physical one. Valerus represents the new. You represent the old. You need to prove that the old ways aren't weak. That they have a power he has forgotten. She is right, my king, Alaric said, his gaze on Ilara filled with a newfound respect. Valerus has seduced the young ones with promises of technology and modern power. He scoffs at the old knowledge, the deep histories stored here. He sees this place as a museum. A tomb. Then we shall show him the tomb has teeth, Cosimir said, a dangerous light entering his eyes. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and a silent communication passed between them. He was seeing her not just as his vulnerability, but as his strategist. What do you propose, librarian? The question was a direct challenge, an offering of trust. She took a deep breath. Valerus thinks you're predictable. He's hunting a weakened, solitary king hiding in the dark. He's not expecting you to go on the offensive. And he's certainly not expecting you to use his own methods against him. She began to move through the archive, her steps purposeful now, pulling an ancient scroll from one shelf, a heavy codex from another. Alaric, are there texts here on sympathetic magic? Wards of misdirection? Illusions? Alaric's eyes lit up. Of course. The Caligari codices. The scrolls of the shadow weavers. But this is forbidden knowledge, my lady. Dangerous. The men hunting us have a length of pipe and a magic compass, Ilara countered dryly. I think we can afford to be a little dangerous. For the next several hours, the sanctum was transformed from a quiet repository into a war room. Guided by Ilara's sharp, logical questions, Alaric became a living search engine, retrieving texts on obscure and powerful rituals. Cosimir, whose knowledge of these arts was vast but archaic, found himself looking at them in a new light through Ilara's modern, analytical lens. She was not a sorceress, she had no innate power. But she had an intuitive understanding of systems, of cause and effect. She saw the rituals not as arcane mysteries, but as a kind of programming, a set of instructions that could be manipulated and repurposed. Here, she said, her finger tracing a complex diagram in a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. This ward is designed to mask a person's life force, to make them invisible to scrying. But it requires a powerful emotional anchor, a heartstone, it calls it. Something the target values above all else. Cosimir and Alaric both looked at each other. The answer was obvious. Valerus would have used something from Casimir's old life, a signet ring, a piece of his ceremonial armor, something that tied him to the throne he had abandoned. But what if we change the anchor? Ilara continued, her eyes bright with excitement. Instead of masking you, what if we tie the signal to something else? Something that moves. Something that leads them on a wild goose chase through the deepest, most dangerous parts of the Undercity. It was a brilliant, simple inversion of the magic. They would not hide from the hunters, they would actively mislead them. They found the ritual they needed, a complex weaving of illusion and redirection. It required 3 components: a focus for the spell, something of Casimir's to act as the bait, and a power source. Casimir took a small, sharp knife from Alaric. Without hesitation, he drew it across his palm. The blood that welled up was dark, almost black, and it did not drip. It seemed to cling to his skin. He pressed his bleeding palm against the open page of the codex, the ancient parchment drinking in his vitality. "The power source," he said, his voice steady. Next, he reached inside his tattered shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. On it was a single, intricately carved locket. He opened it. It was empty. "This was my mother's," he said softly, his gaze distant. "It is one of the few things I kept. Valerus would know of it. He would know its value to me." He placed the locket on the center of the diagram. "The bait. And the focus," Alaric said, looking at Ilara. "The spell requires a clear, unwavering will to direct the illusion. A mind that can hold the new narrative. It is usually the caster." Casimir looked at Ilara, his expression unreadable. "No," he said. "My mind is a battlefield. My emotions are tied too closely to this. Valerus knows how I think. He would anticipate my strategies. We need a mind he cannot read. A perspective he could never predict." He held his hand out to her. "Ilara, I need you to be the focus. I need you to guide the illusion." She stared at his outstretched hand, at the welling blood that was already beginning to heal over. He was asking her to step into the heart of their world, to wield its power, to be the architect of their defense. He was placing his survival, and the survival of his legacy, into her mortal hands. "I don't know how," she whispered, the enormity of the request settling on her. "You don't need to know the words of the spell," he said, his voice a low, compelling murmur. "You just need to tell the story. Create a false trail in your mind. Picture me moving through the tunnels, but not these tunnels. Picture a version of me that is lost, afraid, growing weaker. A version that Valerus expects to find. Hold that image. That will be the light they follow into the darkness." She looked from his intense, trusting eyes to the waiting ritual. Her fear was a cold knot, but her resolve was a fire. She had spent her life in the service of other people's stories. Now, she would write her own. She placed her hand in his. His cold grip enveloped hers, and in that moment, she was no longer just Ilara, the librarian. She was a queen moving a pawn in a deadly game. The ritual began. Alaric's chanting filled the chamber, the ancient words vibrating in the air, in the stone floor, in the very marrow of Ilara's bones. Casimir stood opposite her, his bleeding hand covering hers where it rested on the locket, his other hand gripping her shoulder, anchoring her. He closed his eyes, his power flowing from him into the locket, a raw, elemental force that made the air crackle. It was her job to shape it. She closed her eyes and did as he said. She built a narrative, a fiction. She pictured Casimir, not the king standing before her, but the broken man from the alley. She imagined him fleeing, panicking, leaving a trail of weakened energy. She sent this phantom Casimir down into the deepest, most forgotten catacombs, places Alaric had described as being treacherous, unstable, home to things even older and hungrier than vampires. She wove a story of desperation, a hunt that would lead the hunters far away from the sanctum, deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth. She could feel the magic responding to her thoughts, the raw power Casimir was providing twisting and shaping itself to her will. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She felt a connection to Casimir that was deeper than touch or words, a melding of his power and her mind. For a timeless moment, they were one being, working in perfect, silent concert. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The chanting stopped. The pressure in the air vanished. Ilara swayed on her feet, dizzy and drained, a profound mental exhaustion settling over her. Casimir steadied her, his grip on her shoulder tightening. Alaric rushed to the scrying bowl, a simple stone basin filled with water and silver dust. He stared into its depths, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It is done," he breathed, a slow smile spreading across his weary face. "They have taken the bait. I see their lifelights, they are moving away from us. Following the echo. You have sent them on a fool's errand, My lady, he looked at Ilara with undisguised awe. A masterful deception. Casimir turned Ilara to face him, his hands gentle on her arms. His eyes were dark, but they held a new light, a fierce, burning pride. I put my life in your hands, he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. And you did not falter. She was too tired to form a reply, so she simply nodded, her body trembling with the aftereffects of the ritual. He had called her his vulnerability. But in that moment, she had become his strength. She had not fought with fang and claw, but with her mind, with the quiet, ordered power of a storyteller. And it had been enough. The hunters were gone, for now. They had won the battle. But looking at the grim resolve in Casimir's face, she knew the war was far from over. And Valerus would not be fooled twice. The false trail bought them time, a precious, fragile bubble of peace in the deep, quiet dark. But it was a reprieve, not a victory. Casimir knew it. Alaric knew it. And Ilara, whose senses were now strangely attuned to the currents of tension in the sanctum, felt it most keenly of all. The hunters would eventually realize their error, and when they did, their return would be with a fury born of humiliation. Valerus would not make the same mistake again. He would come himself. We cannot stay here, Casimir announced, his voice echoing in the main chamber. It was several days after the ritual. Ilara was marking time by Alaric's sleep cycles. The sanctum is a fortress, but it is also a trap. Valerus knows of its existence, even if he cannot find it. He will simply lay siege to the old city, block the tunnels, starve us out. He has the patience for it. Alaric looked aghast. Leave the archives. My lord, this is our history, our soul. We cannot abandon it. We do not abandon it, Casimir corrected gently. We are preserving its future by ensuring we have one. We must retake what is mine. We must face Valerus on our own terms, not his. His gaze fell on Ilara. She was sitting at her work table, ostensibly cleaning an ancient astrolabe, but she had been listening to every word. There was a new question in his eyes, a heavy one. This is where your part in this can end, Ilara. Alaric can guide you to a surface exit far from here. You can disappear, start a new life. No one would ever find you. You would be safe. It was the offer of an escape, the one any sane person would take. A return to sunlight, to the simple, predictable rhythm of a human life. She could have her books and her coffee back. She could forget the feel of ancient magic, the weight of a king's trust, the terrifying glow of crimson eyes in the dark. She looked down at her hands. They were smudged with dust and polish. But they were steady. She remembered the feeling of his power flowing through her, of her mind shaping reality. She remembered the look on his face when she had offered him the ruined book of poetry. Safety felt like a pale and colorless thing compared to that. And what about you? She asked, her voice quiet but firm. What is your plan? I will go to the night court, he said. It is the heart of our domain, the seat of power Valerus now occupies. I will challenge him. By the old laws, he cannot refuse a direct challenge for the throne. A challenge he is expecting, she countered, standing up. He has had 50 years to consolidate his power, to win allies, to prepare for your return. You said it yourself, he is ambitious and clever. He will not fight you on fair terms. He will have traps, contingencies. You'll be walking into his stronghold alone. It is my duty, he said, his voice laced with the iron of royal obligation. That's not an answer, she said, her voice rising with a passion that surprised them all. That's an excuse to get yourself killed. You're thinking like a king from an old story, the noble hero walking to his doom. But Valerus isn't from an old story. He's from a new one, and he will use every dirty trick from the modern world to win. She took a step closer to him, her eyes blazing. You need to stop thinking like a monarch and start thinking like a rebel. Like an insurgent. You don't have an army. You have a librarian and an archivist. So we have to be smarter than him. A slow, dangerous smile touched Casimir's lips. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, more alive, and infinitely more perilous. A rebellion, he mused. I have not led one of those in 1,000 years. And what does my rebel librarian propose? Knowledge is power, she said, turning to the towering shelves that surrounded them. Valerus has convinced the court that you are a relic, that your time is past. We need to prove him wrong. We need to give them a reason to question his leadership, a reason to rally to you. There must be something in this library, some secret, some piece of history that Valerus has overlooked or suppressed. A weakness we can exploit. The hunt began. It was a race against time, a desperate search through millennia of secrets. It was Ilara's element. She guided the search with a relentless, systematic precision that left Alaric breathless. She was not looking for magic or weapons, she was looking for information. For leverage. They searched records of bloodlines, treaties, judgments, and laws. 4 days, they found nothing but the dry, dusty record of their people. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ilara was examining a set of property deeds from the late 19th century, records of the vampire community's hidden landholdings within the mortal world. They were tedious, filled with legal jargon. But one name caught her eye. Valerus. He had brokered a deal, selling a significant portion of their ancestral lands, places of power, tied to their oldest bloodlines, to a mortal corporation in exchange for a vast fortune, which he had then used to build his initial power base. Alaric, she called out, her voice sharp with excitement. What is the first law of the conclave? The old archivist looked up from the scroll he was translating. No vampire shall cede the ancient soils to mortals, for to sever the blood from the land is to sever the soul from the body. He recited it from memory, his voice filled with reverence. It is our most sacred covenant. Ilara held up the deed. Then your regent protector, the great champion of your people, built his entire empire on a foundation of heresy. Cosimir took the document from her, his eyes scanning the page. A cold, silent fury built in him, an energy that was more terrifying than any overt rage. He had known Valerus was ambitious, but this was a betrayal of their very nature, a sacrilege of the highest order. Valerus had not just seized power, he had sold their soul to do it. This changes everything, Cosimir said, his voice a low growl. This is not just a challenge for the throne anymore. This is a trial. And I will be his judge. Their plan solidified. It was daring, bordering on suicidal. They would not challenge Valerus in the throne room. They would confront him in the Hall of Echoes, the chamber where the conclave passed its laws and delivered its judgments. They would use Alaric to spread the word of Casimir's return and his challenge, forcing Valerus to attend. And there, in front of the entire court, in the very heart of their society, Ilara would present the evidence of his crime. They would put Valerus himself on trial. It was her idea, her strategy. And it placed her directly in the line of fire. He will kill you the moment he sees you, Cosimir said, his voice flat. The thought was clearly agony to him. He won't, she countered calmly. Not if I am under the protection of the conclave. Alaric, is there a provision for a mortal witness to speak before the court? Alaric's eyes widened. The advocate's clause. An ancient, disused law. A mortal can be granted sanctuary to speak on a matter of grave importance to the community, but they must be sponsored by a lord of a bloodline. They cannot be harmed while the conclave is in session. Then I am her sponsor, Cosimir declared. The night of the confrontation arrived. Alaric had gone ahead, a whisper in the shadows, spreading the word. The entire night court would be gathered. Cosimir stood before a shard of polished obsidian that served as a mirror, dressed not in his alley rags, but in simple, severe black clothing Alaric had kept for him. He looked every inch the king, his power a palpable aura around him. Ilara stood beside him, holding the leather satchel containing the evidence. Her heart was a frantic bird, but her face was calm. Cosimir turned to her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was cold, as always, but there was a warmth in his eyes she had never seen before. In my long life, I have known warriors, sorcerers, and queens, he said softly. But I have never known anyone with a courage like yours. You face a room of predators with nothing but the truth as your shield. The truth is a good shield, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. And I'm not alone. He leaned in, his face close to hers. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. The thought sent a jolt of electricity through her. Instead, he simply rested his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound, intimate trust. "No," he whispered. "You are not." Together, they left the quiet safety of the sanctum and walked toward the heart of the enemy's territory, toward a trial by fire that would either see a king restored or a rebellion crushed before it had even begun. The fate of the vampire world rested on the courage of a mortal librarian. The Night Court was a cavernous, cathedral-like space carved from the living rock deep beneath the city. It was not a place of Gothic gloom, but of stark, brutalist grandeur. Veins of phosphorescent minerals pulsed in the high, vaulted ceilings, casting a cold, blue-white light over everything. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, chilled stone, and power. Hundreds of vampires filled the tiered stone benches that rose in a steep semicircle, a silent, watching sea of ancient, predatory faces. They were dressed in the height of modern fashion and in robes that could have been centuries old, a disquieting mix of the ancient and the contemporary. Their stillness was absolute, their attention focused on the raised dais at the center of the chamber. Valerus sat there, not on the simple, unadorned stone throne that was Casimir's by right, but on a more ornate, newly built chair beside it, a clear political statement. He was handsome in a cruel, polished way, his dark hair perfectly styled, his suit exquisitely tailored. He projected an aura of smooth, modern authority. He looked like a CEO, not a king. He was addressing the assembled court, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics, speaking of progress, of their people taking their rightful place as the secret masters of the human world. Then, the great stone doors at the back of the chamber groaned open. A collective, silent gasp went through the crowd as Casimir entered. He did not stride in like a conquering hero. He walked with a slow, deliberate gravity, his simple black clothing a stark contrast to the finery around him. He was a piece of the old world, a living embodiment of the history Valerus sought to erase. Beside him, small and utterly out of place, was Alara, her knuckles white where she clutched the strap of her satchel. Every eye in the chamber was on them. The whispers that followed were like the rustling of dry leaves. Valerus stopped his speech mid-sentence, his handsome face tightening into a mask of controlled fury. This was not how he had envisioned this confrontation. "Casimir," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You have returned from your self-imposed exile. We had feared you lost to the grief of ages." "My grief is for what has become of our people in my absence, Valerus," Casimir replied, his voice calm and resonant, carrying to every corner of the chamber without effort. He stopped at the foot of the dais, his gaze sweeping over the assembled court, acknowledging them, reminding them of who he was. "I have returned to reclaim what is mine. The throne is yours, should you wish to bear its burdens again," Valerus said smoothly, a magnanimous smile on his lips. "But our world has changed. The old ways of hiding in the shadows are over. A new era of strength is upon us." "There is no strength in heresy," Casimir stated, the words a thunderclap in the charged silence. "There is no honor in betraying our most sacred laws for personal gain." Valerus's smile faltered. A baseless accusation from a king who abandoned his post. "Not baseless," Casimir said. "And not without a witness," he gestured to Alara. "I invoke the advocate's clause. I sponsor this mortal, Alara, to speak before the conclave. She brings evidence of a crime so profound it threatens the soul of our nation." A shocked murmur spread through the court. The advocate's clause had not been invoked in centuries. It was a piece of legal theater, a relic. But it was the law. Valerus was trapped. To deny the request would be to show fear, to break the very laws he claimed to uphold. His eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed on Alara. The sheer force of his venomous gaze was a physical blow, but she stood her ground, her chin held high. "Very well," Valerus said, his voice tight. "Let the mortal have her say. Let us see what fantasies the old king has filled her head with." Alara walked forward, her sensible shoes making small, defiant sounds on the stone floor. She felt 1,000 pairs of ancient eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. She could feel their silent hunger, their contempt for her fragile mortality. But she also felt Casimir's presence behind her, a solid wall of support. She would not falter. She reached the dais and turned to face the court, not Valerus. She was speaking to them, not to him. "My lords and ladies of the conclave," she began, her voice clear and steady, the voice of a librarian used to commanding a quiet room. "I am not one of you. I am a creature of sunlight and short years. But I am also a keeper of records. A student of history. And history is a testament of facts." She opened her satchel and pulled out the 19th century deeds, her movements precise and practiced. "I present to you these documents. They are records from the mortal world, detailing the sale of lands your people hold sacred. Lands in the Carpathians, in the old country, where your most ancient bloodlines began. She held one up. "These lands were sold to a mortal industrialist in 1888. They were sold in exchange for shares in railways, in steel mills, in the building blocks of the new mortal economy." She let the implication hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "The vampire who brokered this deal, who signed this bill of sale, who traded your birthright for a portfolio of stocks and bonds, was Valerus." An uproar erupted in the chamber. The vampires were on their feet, shouting, their ancient stillness shattered. Valerus's face had gone pale, his composure finally cracking. He had thought those records buried, forgotten in the dusty archives of the human world he so disdained. He had never imagined someone would find them, let alone understand their significance. "Lies!" Valerus roared, rising from his chair. "Forgery. The mortal is a pawn, a trick. The documents are authentic," Ilara said calmly, placing them on the stone dais. "The signatures can be verified. The history can be traced. Valerus told you he was building a new future for you. What he was really doing was selling your past to fund his own ambition. He asks you to sever your ties with the old ways, because he had already sold the land to which those ways were tied. He broke the first law, the most sacred law of all." The court was in chaos. Old loyalties were shattering. The younger vampires who had supported Valerus looked confused, while the elder lords, the ones whose bloodlines were tied to the very lands that had been sold, looked upon him with expressions of pure murder. Valerus saw his power base crumbling before his eyes. In a single, desperate act, he lunged. Not at Cosimir, but at Ilara. He moved with the same impossible speed she had seen Cosimir use, a blur of motion, his hand outstretched, his fingernails lengthening into claws. If he could silence the witness, he could perhaps regain control. But Cosimir was ready. He moved to intercept, a black shadow meeting Valerus's attack. The two vampires collided with a sound like cracking stone. They were a whirlwind of motion, a deadly dance of impossible speed and strength. But the fight was not the true climax. The climax had already happened. The truth was out. Ilara did not flinch or scream. She simply stood her ground, watching as Cosimir, fueled by a righteous fury she had never seen, systematically and brutally dismantled his rival. It was not a long fight. Cosimir was the older, the stronger, and his power was rooted in the very history Valerus had sought to sell. He fought with the weight of millennia behind him. He broke Valerus's arm, then his leg, disabling him with a cold, terrifying precision. Finally, he had Valerus pinned to the floor of the dais, his hand around his throat. The chamber was silent once more, every eye on the two kings. Cosimir could have killed him. He had every right. But he looked up, his gaze finding Ilara's. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not like this. Not with brute force. With the law." Cosimir understood. He released his grip and stood up, leaving Valerus gasping on the floor. He turned to the conclave, his face grim, his authority absolute. "Valerus has broken our most sacred law," he declared, his voice ringing with power. "He has betrayed our people. He has forfeited his right to lead, his right to exist among us. I do not ask for his death. I ask for a judgment worthy of his crime. I ask for exile. Let him be cast out into the mortal lands he so admires. Stripped of his title, his power, and his place among us. Let him wander the bright, loud world he sought to emulate, forever an outsider to us, and to them." It was a judgment more poetic and more devastating than death. To a being of power and community, Eternal solitude was the ultimate punishment. A low murmur of assent rose from the court. The elder lords nodded, their faces grim. The judgment was passed. The rebellion was over. The king had returned. And he had won, not with a sword, but with a library book. The aftermath was quiet. Valerus's stunned supporters slipped away into the shadows, their new era dead before it had truly begun. The elder lords of the conclave approached Cosimir, one by one, bowing their heads and pledging their fealty anew. The Night Court, which had been on the brink of civil war, was his once more. But Casimir's attention was not on them. It was on Ilara. He came to her, ignoring the crowd of his subjects, and led her from the dais into a small antechamber, a quiet space away from the prying eyes. The adrenaline that had sustained her was gone, leaving her trembling and exhausted. "It's over," she whispered, leaning against a cold stone wall. "It is," he said. He stood before her, the restored king, the weight of his responsibilities already settling on his shoulders. But the look in his eyes was not that of a monarch addressing a subject. It was the look of a man seeing the center of his world. "You did not just save my life, Ilara. You saved our soul. You reminded us of what we are, of the history that gives us weight, that gives us meaning." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw. His touch was still cold, but it felt like coming home. "I offered you a way out," he said softly. "A return to your world. That offer still stands. I could give you anything you want. A new identity, wealth, protection for the rest of your days. You have earned it." She looked into his ancient, weary eyes, eyes that now held a flicker of hope she had put there. She thought of her quiet apartment, her predictable routines, the life she had lost. It seemed like a story about someone else, read long ago. It was a safe harbor, but her ship had already sailed for a new and uncharted sea. "I don't want a new life," she said, her voice finding its strength. "I like this one." She allowed a small smile to touch her lips. "It's a bit more exciting than the Dewey Decimal System." A look of profound relief washed over his features, so deep it seemed to erase centuries of loneliness. "But this world, it is a world of darkness, Ilara. Of blood and endless night. You are a creature of the sun. Then you'll have to make some room for a little light," she replied. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her cheek. The contrast of her warmth and his cold was no longer jarring. It was just them. A balance. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, "we rebuild. We find a new way. Not the old way of hiding, and not Valerus's way of conquering. Something in between. Something better." He searched her eyes. "But I cannot do it alone. I have been a solitary king for too long. I need a queen." The word hung in the air, a silent, breathtaking proposal. He wasn't offering her a crown of gold and jewels. He was offering her a partnership. A seat at his side, not behind him. A chance to help him build the future she had envisioned, one where knowledge was valued as much as power, where history was a guide, not a chain. She did not give him a verbal answer. Instead, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. His lips were cold, like marble, but they were not lifeless. There was a tremor of surprise, of want, of a hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with connection. The kiss was brief, chaste, but it was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was the beginning of their new story. He pulled back slightly, his dark eyes shimmering with an emotion so deep it looked like starlight. "The court will not understand," he whispered. "Then we'll have to teach them," she whispered back. They walked out of the antechamber and back into the Hall of Echoes, hand in hand. The remaining lords and ladies of the court fell silent, their eyes widening at the sight of their ancient king holding the hand of the mortal librarian. It was a new image for a new era. The king of shadows and the lady of light. It was impossible. It was scandalous. And it was their future. Their reign would not be one of fear or of conquest, but of something far more radical, a quiet, determined, and courageous attempt to understand. And for a world that had been trapped in the dark for so long, that was the most revolutionary idea of all.